Welcome to another in the series of our stories about Cannon Falls residents, being done for the Cannon Falls History Museum as well as Channel 12. As always, like to thank Mike Gesme for masterminding the whole project and filming and editing. Today his able assistant is Sam, who's taking Dick Mensing's place because Dick is in front of the camera instead of behind it today. I've got Dick along with Lyle Wilson to talk somewhat about the history of Minnesota malting in Cannon Falls today. I think first though we should start, we need to clear up a misconception because I and many people thought who would be more Cannon Falls natives than Dick Mensing and Lyle Wilson. As it turns out, neither one of them are Cannon Falls natives. So maybe you'll talk just a little bit about your early years and how you both got to Cannon Falls. We'll start with Lyle.
Yeah. Oh, I was born in Britton, South Dakota back in the 1900s, and my family moved to St. Paul in about 1937. We moved to Cannon Falls about 1943 when my dad bought the Shell station, which was located where the St. Pius parking lot is right now. So that was about the time I started high school, 9th grade at Cannon Falls.
What prompted them to come to Cannon Falls other than a business opportunity?
That's what it was.
That's what it was, okay.
Yeah, that was the thing, the business opportunity. He bought that Shell station from a fellow by the name of Ed King.
Okay. Just as a sidelight, one of my daughters had a roommate from Britton, South Dakota. I didn't know anyone besides her was from there. So.
Yeah, it's the northern part of South Dakota and the second county in from Minnesota. So it's different country.
Kind of a tough time age-wise for you to move to a new town. How did you adapt to Cannon Falls at that point?
Well, it was pretty easy, I guess. I think back about it, if we would have stayed where we were living at that time, I would have gone to St. Paul Central High School. So I don't know what that would have been like.
That would have been different.
In thinking back, I'm lucky I ended up in Cannon Falls.
And Dick, tell us a little of your background.
Sure. When I was born, my parents were living in Minneapolis, and that's where I was born. And it took me a year and a half to convince them that we should move to Cannon Falls. But I had some help with another relative, which we'll talk about later.
What can you tell us about your early years in Cannon Falls? I mean, you're an exemplary student, and
I made it through the high school.
You made it through the
I
high
did make National Honor Society, which was a surprise to me when they announced my name. But well, one of my major things that I accomplished pre-teen or early teen is I started a lawn mowing business in town, and in my busiest year, I was on 33 different lawns in town, including 2 churches.
Wow.
And I had steady customers of 22 of those 33. The other 10 or 11 were vacation type calls. I did graduate from Cannon Falls. I went on and graduated St. Cloud State with a degree in business administration. And from there I went into officers training in the Air Force and got my gold bars there, and then went into navigator training. And that took, officer training was 90 days, and nav training was 10 months. And then I got assigned to aerial refuelers. The first one was the KC-97, where we'd be refueling bombers and fighters in the air. And then I had the opportunity to transfer into the KC-135, which back in those days was a brand new airplane to the Air Force. In fact, our squadron was sending crews to Boeing out in Washington to bring back the new airplanes. Then when I came back, I worked with our Minnesota Malting's sister company, Minnesota Grain Pearling, for a few years, including a year and a half in East Grand Forks while we were building a new plant up there. Then I came back to Minnesota Malting and stayed here until we closed in 2003.
You should probably, for the camera, tell your, because it's such a great story of refueling in the air. One of our people we've done before for the R story, actually.
Okay. The KC-135 was a four-man crew. They had two pilots, a navigator, and a boom operator. The navigator was the one that actually conducted the rendezvous with the receiver. And the receiver may be a B-47, a B-52, B-58 back in that era. We also did some fighters. And I did the talking and to the receiver, and we were doing an oval, and as we were coming towards one another, we'd make a 180-degree turn, and the bomber then would come in behind us. The boom operator was laying on his stomach on a bench in the back of the airplane, flying what was called the boom, which he could angle around back and left and right, up and down, or any combination of that. Plus, that thing extended 17 feet. And he actually, when the bomber got into position, put the end of that into a connection on the top of the bomber. And then we started pumping fuel as long as the bomber stayed in position. Then when we had the offload to him that was required, we just disconnected and went our own directions.
But I'm referring to your story about how you talked to, you heard a voice in the air.
Oh, okay, yes. We never knew who it was we were refueling, and one day we made contact with a B-47, and things were quiet for a few moments, and pretty soon this voice said, "Dick," and I immediately recognized the voice as Herb Dablow. And I said, "Herb," and that was it. And we did celebrate that over a few beers a couple of days later.
But that's a pretty amazing small world story.
Yes. Herb was in the same bomb wing that we were in, but the B-47s did their thing and the KC-135s did our thing.
Sure. Lyle, tell us a little bit about what you, after high school years, what you did at that point.
Well, immediately after I graduated in 1948, and that first summer, like June, July, I worked at the Standard Station downtown where First Farmers and Merchants Bank is now.
I remember that.
And then in the fall, I went to work at Minnesota Malting. The first project was to, well, I went to a lacrosse brewery for training to learn how to analyze malt, and then it was back to Cannon Falls and worked on setting up the laboratory. So over the years, I maybe worked in the lab maybe for 3 years, but I was kind of, at that time, somewhat of draft bait, so to speak. It was about the time of the Korean War, and I was at the right age, and but it never happened. I was just kept on working, and I did join the National Guard and transferred to the Cannon Falls Army Reserve when John Birch and Bill Golden started the reserve unit in Cannon Falls. I know the various jobs at the malting company after the lab. I guess I was an electrician's helper. I worked in the plant just doing production work. Later moved into some maintenance work. Later, as time went on, I was the maltster, the guy that took care of the malt plant during the day and supervised how the germination and the watering and so forth took place. And then later became plant superintendent as time went by. And that's what I was when I retired in 1995.
Very good. I think we'll get back into the malting process because I think that's something most people don't understand very much, and who knows more about that than Lyle. But Dick, maybe you should give us a bit of the kind of history of why Minnesota malting is here to begin with.
Oh boy. Well, about 100 years ago, back in 1912, my grandfather started building commercial grain and malt here. And I did some searching, getting ready for this particular program, and I came up with a schedule and kind of tracked my grandfather's life in the malting industry.
Good.
Granddad was born in 1868 in Kansas City, Missouri. And when he was 20 years old, 1888, he moved to Chicago and started working for George Bullen and Sons Malting Company. And he ended up being the chief maltster for 2 of their plants that were located in different portions of Chicago. In 1906, he must have impressed the Bullens because they transferred him to a plant they owned at that time in Red Wing. And he became the chief maltster at the Red Wing plant. And that was the structure that we recently knew as Red Wing Malting Company, which is no longer in existence, and the building is no longer there in Red Wing. In 1912, he left Red Wing and moved to Cannon Falls to start commercial grain and malting company. And he told me at one time that Goodhue County back in that era was the largest barley producing county in the United States. And I got thinking about that, and we had competitors in Winona, 2 in Red Wing, 1 in Shakopee, and Ham's Brewing had their own malting company.
Mm-hmm.
So that probably explains why at one time there were 3 malting companies in Goodhue County.
Yes.
In 5 years after he started commercial grain and malting, in 1917, Prohibition hit. There was no major need for malt production on a legal basis. So Granddad shut down the plant and moved to Winnipeg and was working for Dominion Malting Company, and which is still in business in Winnipeg. Then in 1933, when Prohibition ended, I should say during Prohibition, Granddad wasn't sure that Prohibition was going to last a very long time. So as other plants were closing down and selling equipment, he was buying some of that equipment and having it shipped to Cannon Falls and
Really?
stored where commercial grain had been.
And where do you think that was location-wise? Was it where the...
Commercial grain was right where
Was right
part
where-
of the existing facility
It
is
okay.
now.
Okay.
In fact, the office that Commercial Grain built is still up there, and that was Lyle's office for most of his time.
Okay.
But he moved to Winona and was opening up Freighter Malting Malt House, and then they sent him to Red Wing to open the Red Wing Malt House, which would have been the same plant that he had been in before Prohibition. And then in 1939, he founded Minnesota Malting Company, and he had an original design for a malt house that ended up being called the Flexi Malt. I don't think he came up with that name. Do you, Lyle?
I don't think so.
I think the industry came up with that.
Yeah, yeah.
He could never understand why they took green malt and had to transfer it to a separate area for kilning. He designed our plant here to do the kilning in the same compartment that the barley was growing in to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And it eliminated the labor and the possible damaging of the malt kernels from happening in that transfer. Granddad, my dad told me that Granddad did have a life goal to own and operate a malt house with an annual capacity of 1 million bushels. And Minnesota Malting Company reached that capacity, 1 million bushels, in 1958, which happens to be the same year Granddad died.
Mm-hmm.
So from 1888 to 1958.
Wow.
He was in the malting industry. But I just pointed out to Lyle a little earlier that Lyle has seniority over Granddad because Granddad was here for only 20 years. And Lyle was with the Mensing family for 48 years. And Lyle has been a very loyal employee, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. It was a great ride, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
Well, maybe every hour.
Or every hour. Yeah.
When I first started in the plant, it was when I was in college. And the day I showed up for work, Dad called me into his office. And he said, "Dick, we're happy to have you here at Minnesota Malting as a third generation." He said, "But I want to let you know you are not working for me. Lyle is your boss. You will not come running to me with any problems. You do what he tells you." And I think I did.
As far as I know.
I won't admit to it.
No self-incrimination.
I'm just thinking, that one of the major events in United States history recently, of course, was Prohibition, but in a number of ways. But to think of that whole industry basically shutting down for, 15, 16 years,
Yes,
whatever
yeah.
it was, and then starting back up again
Right.
must have been a monumental
I'm sure
task.
it was, yes,
And
I'm
just
sure.
A lot of as you said, he was kind of hoarding equipment, so maybe he was more set than a lot of people were at that point. But Lyle, that might be a good place to kind of describe to viewers what the whole malting process entails, because it's not something that most people, we always knew that Minnesota Malting was probably the premier place to work in Cannon Falls, and yet most people really didn't understand what went on.
Well, that's true. The misconception of people that don't know what a malt plant is, they say, "Boy, you guys are really lucky. You always have a cool drink on hand." Well, that's really not true. Water is the cool drink. But basically, I guess malting involves, at least modern day malting, using cleaned and grated barley, separated by length and width, and to achieve uniform malting characteristics from the barley. So the process involves, oversimplified, soaking barley in water for about 1.5 to 2 days. A lot of changes take place. The water is changed, it's aerated, the water is drained, and then after this, what's commonly known as steeping process in tanks, the barley is moved to what we call compartments. A compartment is a rectangular box with a perforated floor, and the steeped barley is spread out over this perforated floor. And the reason for the perforation is so that air can be passed through this uniform heap of barley. And there's a machine there that turns it, because wet barley, one of the prerequisites of good malting barley, it has to have a good germination capacity, and so thereby it has to make the air pass through it uniformly. The barley needs to be level, and it generates its own heat, so it has to be cool, and conditioned air needs to be passed through it during this germination process, which might be anywhere from 4 to 6 days, depending on the variety and the kind of barley it is. Then after the barley is germinated, good malting barley has the hull intact. So during the germination of the barley from the germ end, the plant that would come out of the ground, we call the acrospire, grows underneath the hull. Try to grow it out to the full length of the kernel. And at the end of that time, in the Minnesota Malting's process, the compartments are changed from a germinating box to a drying or kilning box. So by changing a series of doors and slides, that compartment is converted to a drying operation, drawing large volumes of heated air at varying temperatures, controlled, accurately controlled. In the old days, it was a 2-day process of drying. Modern day process is a 24-hour drying process. Naturally, it involves moving a lot more air, but that's the way it is. Do it quicker and faster. And barley starch, there's quite a loss. There's a loss of weight and a gain in volume in the malting process. You start out maybe with 12 or 13% barley, and you end up with a 4% moisture product. So you got about 9% moisture loss right there. And through the germination process, you have a product, the rootlets, the part of the plant that would normally be rootlets, we call them sprouts. They're not part of the finished product, they are a byproduct, so that's about a 2% loss, and you have a certain amount of loss just by the respiration of the grain. And so that's what it ends up being, a loss in weight and a gain in volume. So the product malt is shipped out. In the old days, it was shipped out in bags, sometimes in barrels, sometimes by truck. Usually, in modern day, it's practically all by rail in bulk, in hopper cars. So it during this process, it needs to be handled carefully. Not to so you don't. The brewer wants the malt to be hull intact. They don't want to buy a bunch of chaff, and so it's handled under the gentlest conditions so that it arrives whole kernels, dust-free, and dry. And that's basically what it is. It's a grain handling operation.
As I recall, there's a 24-hour a day, 365-day a year operation, and why was that so critical that people be there at any stage of that?
Well, you have, groups of compartments, and you have a situation where you have various compartments in different stages. So if you're, say for instance, if you had 6 compartments, 5 of them would be during the germination process, and the 6th one would be drying. Tomorrow, that one that was drying would be done. You would empty that compartment of the completed finished product, put a fresh batch of steeped barley into that, which you had steeped 2 days before that. That's barley that had been steeped for 2 days would go into that compartment that was just emptied, and all your germinating compartments over a 24-hour period would have advanced 1 day in their growing process. So it went on like that. So every day you had work. Every day you put you took off a batch of finished product. Every day you put in another batch of barley into the steeping process. So and it needed a tender, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So every day, whether it was Sunday or holiday or your birthday or somebody else's birthday, there was work to be done.
Yep. And tell me, what was the kind of employment number of people at the peak?
I think we reached about 43 or 44 at the peak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and only plant and
Yeah,
plant lab and office.
And one man as a salesperson who lived in Connecticut.
Oh, really? I was going to say somebody had to obviously sell all that product that was coming out daily, but that was kind of an outside person per se.
But he was an employee.
He was an employee.
But he did not live here.
Yeah. And over the years, I mean, I watched things being built constantly, but he was doing a good job selling, I guess, because
Yes.
you were building.
For a while, there were a number of years when we oversold ourselves and would have to buy from our competitors in order to supply our customers. And that's when we knew that we needed to expand.
Yep. And what was it, a perishable product that you had to use, or could you store it then?
It could be stored, yeah.
Yeah.
It could be stored a reasonable amount of time, 10 months to a
10,
year.
okay,
yeah.
okay.
And it really, the malt got aged, and some customers required aged malt, at least 90 days. As malt aged, it took on a more aromatic smell.
Okay.
And that was part of the business too, you know, in the when there's a lot of beer sales, summertime, the breweries were using and buying more malt than the plant produced. So, so during the winter time, we'd produce more than we sold.
Sure,
So
okay.
then that's why a lot of storage, inventory would go up. Spring came, you were shipping more than you were making, inventory went down.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And this is probably a foolish question, but I mean, there's all kinds of beers obviously today, and I guess historically there have been. Is there one type of malt spec, or are there a number of different malt specs because of differences in beers?
You want to handle that one?
Every customer, the way it ended up, every customer had their own specifications
They
on
did.
the malt.
Okay.
Some of them were very similar, some of them were way out. And you talk about the number of breweries. It was back in the 70s, I believe, Lyle, wasn't it, that there was only 77 or 78 breweries in the United States?
Yeah.
Today there are over 2,000 breweries. But the difference in those two numbers are the microbrewers
Yes.
and their use of malt per batch, per pounds of malt per batch are usually higher than what the large breweries are, but their total volume is so small.
Yes, yeah.
Whereas the large breweries that we were shipping to were having rail car loads of barley or malt being sent to them. The little breweries are having 100-pound bags of malt being sent. But even their recipes required 60 to 80% pale malt, which is what we produced, pale malt to specifications. So near the end there, what we did was we would ship pale malt to a company that was specializing in the sale of specialty malts to these microbrewers. And our malt would end up being 60 to 80% of the pallet of malt that was going to the microbrewer.
Okay.
But that still was a long ways from a rail car of malt.
Yeah.
And our largest customer was, 40 or 50 or 60 cars a month, wasn't it?
Sure. You want to talk about the growth a little bit in those years?
Well, we started off with 3 germination compartments and a wooden elevator. When we first moved to Cannon Falls, our family lived in a house just up the street from where we are right now. And Dad used to claim that when I was in the outdoor playpen, he could hear me screaming while he was working on this elevator. We would gradually add, let's see, from the first 3 compartments, we added 2 more, didn't we, back in those days? We were 5, or did we go to 7 compartments?
Well, I think first there was 3, and then 1 more,
Yeah.
then maybe 1, then maybe 2 more, and then 1, and 2, and 1, and 3, and 2, about in that order.
Yeah. I know there was always building going on.
Yeah, there were
in the summer
years.
months.
To a total of 18 compartments, and we have 3 different sizes in those compartments.
Yeah.
The smallest ones are the ones that were originally built, except for some later ones that, because of the shortage of space for them, even though they're more recently built, they are only the same size as the first three.
Okay.
Then we had what we thought was a large kiln or compartment, and that ended up being the middle-sized ones. And when we went to a separate building, to plant number 2, that was a 4,000 bushel malt house compartment then.
Yep, yep.
The elevators, the wooden elevator was the original, built on the original footings of commercial grain and malt.
Okay.
And then in about 1948, a silo-type elevator was built for barley. And then the first slip-form elevator was in 1954.
Yep.
And then an addition to that was in 56. Yeah. And then D elevator was next was that in 60 when we built the first 3 compartments? in
About
plant
that,
2?
about that time. I think they both came at about the same time.
Yeah. And the most recent one was in 82.
2.
That's the largest and tallest elevator that we've got here.
Okay.
Built in 82.
We should mention, for those who aren't picking up on this, we're viewing the Minnesota Malting in the background of us. We're actually sitting in the Cannon Falls City Hall building now, but it was a building that Minnesota Malting built as their office building prior to that time. So it's a beautiful day, beautiful scenery behind us. But Dick, you talked a little bit about your grandfather, A.R. Mensing,
Yes.
and I did not know him. I knew your dad, Don, but was your grandfather active until the time he passed away in the business? Or?
Yes. Well, how active in the business he was, I'm not real sure. Dad had become rather active. My grandfather had kind of twisted Dad's arm real strongly to help him get this plant started. And my dad at that time was selling coal stokers. Those were a machine that automatically fed coal to your furnace at the house. You had to fill it every once in a while, but you didn't have to tend to it every day or twice a day. He was also doing some violin teaching at McPhail School of Music.
Okay.
And they weren't real excited about moving to Cannon Falls, as I understand it. So they decided they'd give it 5 years and see what happens. Well, he stayed here until the end. But Granddad was a very active individual. How active? I was too young to understand how active he was with the day-to-day business. Lyle might know more than I do along that line. But he was physically very active. He did an awful lot of walking, and as he got older, people would stop and ask him if he wanted to ride, and he'd, no, just go, and he'd wave his cane. No. And he would walk from here to our house over on the west side of town quite regularly. Well, the last winter that he was alive, he slipped on some ice and broke or severely sprained a wrist. And it was in the recovery of that in June that he finally passed away. He was diabetic and needed regular insulin shots. But I do remember him as being a very active individual.
Yeah. I should mention that long ago when I was in high school, and for many years before and after, I guess, the scholarship to be won was the A.R. Mensing Scholarship, which...
Yes, my grandfather started that, and he didn't name it after himself. He named it after his my uncle, his second son, Anthony Robert Jr.
Okay.
And so many people in town think it was named after Granddad himself, but no, he named it after his son, who by that time had been killed in his World War II airplane accident.
Oh, okay. Okay.
He was involved in ferrying C-47s to Alaska to be given to the Russians, the Lend-Lease program. And their plane hit a mountain in Canada, and it took 5 years before the wreckage was found.
Okay. my memory isn't that good, but for the cost of college today, which is kind of phenomenal, but in that era, the scholarship and the summer employment it guaranteed probably helped someone pretty much get through college, I would assume.
I'm sure it did. In 1954, when the program started, it was $500 a year for 4 years, guaranteed,
Yeah,
as long as you stayed in school.
right.
And then it was optional for the student to accept summer employment at Minnesota Malting Company, and for a large number of years they were being paid union scale.
Yeah,
Till the union started objecting to that, and so it was cut back a little bit. But it ended up being that that was the valuable portion of the scholarship in
Sure.
later years. The $500 didn't do what it used to do.
yeah, yeah, no, that's right, but it did a lot more then than it does today, that's for
Yes.
sure.
And Lyle had to put up with all of those people.
Yeah, it was a progressive thing, so there are summers when, after it got going, you had 4
Sure,
scholarship winners working in the plant. But everybody learned something, and I still meet, not that I can remember their names, but I still meet Mensing scholarship kids
yeah,
along the way.
yeah, and they were top of the
And there's quite a
top-notch kids, most of them, for
Yep,
sure.
Yes,
yep,
yes.
There had to be quite a few of them.
Maybe you want to talk a little bit about other people who worked here over the years and their contributions as well. Some of them are still with us and are around Cannon Falls, some
Yeah.
of them are not, but
We do. We had good people working in the plant. A lot of talented people, you know, in production work, maintenance, elevators. You know, besides the Mensing family that made Minnesota Malting go, there were some fellows that some people don't know, but Dr. Robert Heyman, Don Mensing hired him from a Chicago company. He taught us a lot about good manufacturing practices and sanitation practices, which were coming into greater importance. Dick's uncle, John Osland, he was an engineer by trade, did a lot of good things for the company as far as engineering for air handling and drying, and
He's the
Yeah.
one that pretty well engineered going from 2-day drying to 1-day drying,
he did.
which upped our capacity.
Yeah.
absolutely.
And well, Tom Hartzell managed a lot of people and quality control in the laboratory, and he had a terrific staff that worked there a long time.
Yes,
Dick's cousin, Bob Snook, came from another company and was part of Minnesota Malting to help, along with Dick, make it go in the later years.
Bob's dad had worked in the company also in the early days.
That's right. I kind of, you know, when Bob's dad went on to other things, I kind of was at a point to take his place as the maltster in the plant. The guy that took care of the germinating compartments and did the supervising of that.
you must have gotten much more sophisticated over the years. You said you kind of started in the early days of the lab. What would the lab have progressed to? You were analyzing every batch of malt, I suspect.
Yeah, it progressed a whale of a lot. I did some pretty minor things that probably had, you know, the chemical analysis probably amounted to a handful of things, and the physical analysis not much more. But as the lab progressed, and after my time, malt analysis would amount to a sheet and a half or 2 sheets of paper, you know,
Yeah.
of the chemical and physical analysis of a single batch of malt or a single rail car malt. And the customers' demands increased, and so did all the, the requirements of the malt analysis.
Sure.
We were analyzing each batch of malt that we pulled off out every day and each shipment that went out, plus any grain businesses involved in commingling,
Blending.
blending.
Sure.
And every time we made a blend of some sort, we would analyze that also. I don't know if you did all of those back when you started, or if it was just the kilns.
There was a time. Well, there was a time when I did that.
Okay.
But you're right. A rail car of malt probably represented bits and pieces of 5 to 10 different batches of malt that came out of the plant, because to meet the customer specifications and to balance the variation of the production, it was a blending operation.
Sure.
Dick, I'd like to mention a couple of original and early investors
Oh,
in
good, yeah.
Minnesota Malting Company. The pharmacist Bill Schofield was one of the early investors, and his shares of stock passed on to Chuck Schofield and to Pat Rabine.
Okay.
Dr. Carl Fitzy, who was a doctor at Mineral Springs. He was an early investor, and his stock passed on to his children. Then there was a Judge Leo Murphy from Winona, who I think probably was a friend of my grandfather's the first time he was in Winona.
Okay.
And his stock passed on to his son, also Leo Murphy. I don't know if they had the same letters or if they used juniors and seniors. And that second Leo Murphy was a stockholder up to the changing of the guard when I took over as the presidency. And then we also had a potential customer that loaned Granddad some money to build, and Granddad was to pay that back by shipping malt to that particular company. That was Minnesota Brewing, who at that time was brewing Grain Belt Premium.
Okay.
And then at one point in our history, my dad offered shares of stock to our employees, and Lyle Wilson made an investment.
Okay. Good. And like so many things in life, things do change, unfortunately. Cannon Falls was the premier flour milling region of the country at one time, and unfortunately that came and went. And
Wheat and barley grow together.
Yes, they do. Yeah, and partly barley production moved. That
Yes,
certainly
it did.
wasn't the only reason that things changed here, but barley production wasn't something that happened in Cannon Falls as I grew up very much.
For hundreds of years, the barley growing area in the United States has been moving north and west. Back in the 80s or 90s, we were suffering from a disease that barley was susceptible to. And I read an article, and the person that gave me the article to read told me after I'd read it that what I was reading was an article that was 100 years old, and it sounded like exactly what we were going through.
Really?
But their problems were happening in Indiana and Illinois.
Oh,
Our problems were happening in North Dakota, western Minnesota. Now the barley is pretty well moved on to Montana and into Canada.
And for economic reasons too, corn came in.
Sure.
More return per acre.
yeah.
Climate, I don't know if Minnesota nights are damp nights are bad for barley.
Okay.
It gets moist and it stains the hull, the grain. Brewers do not like that.
Okay.
They like bright, white-looking kernels of malt. So
it must be a fairly drought-resistant type crop if it's moved into the Dakotas and Montana, I would guess then.
It's an early crop.
It's an early crop,
It's
yeah.
an early
Yeah.
crop, which makes a
Yes,
difference.
they start harvesting in the middle of July.
Okay.
Yeah.
In fact, I was at a conference one time where a barley grower told the whole conference that one of the reasons, and one of the most important reasons, that he grows barley is because he can start using his expensive combine much earlier.
Mm. Makes some sense, I guess.
Yes.
I guess I'd be remiss to not say too that both Lyle and Dick have been very active in the Cannon Falls community, giving to the community as well as the workplace. And Dick, I know, was on both city council and school board and a number of other things, probably that I don't know all of them.
Fair Board,
Fair board, yeah, of course.
Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah. You want to talk about any
Yeah.
of those
And
things?
I volunteer for Channel 12.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. What's been the most rewarding of those out of work things you've done over the years?
I think the Cannon Valley Fair was, really. It was a lot of work. For a while I was secretary treasurer. My grandfather was on the fair board
Really?
back when he was in town. When I was secretary treasurer, I stumbled across an old secretary's minutes, and Granddad's name was on it. And in the recent history moment that the museum has, they did one on the fair, and they show a shot of a stock certificate, and my grandfather's name and signature is on that stock certificate.
pretty
I don't
neat.
know what office he held, but it must have been either president or secretary.
Yeah.
And it was just fun seeing the people having fun after we'd put in a year's worth of work.
Yeah. And this coming summer is the 100th anniversary
Yes,
of the
it
fair,
is.
which is quite a testimonial to keep anything going that
Right.
long. So,
Oh, when I was secretary and I came across this old secretarial book, at a particular meeting, Granddad and another man were assigned the project of driving to Zumbrota and checking on some bricks that might be available for building a building.
interesting. Lyle, of course, spent many years on the fire department and chief in the end. You had to run from work quite a few times doing that, I suspect.
That happens, and sometimes fires are during the night, too.
Yes, they aren't very well planned, are they?
So are Malthouse
And
problems.
so are Mount House
Yeah,
problems, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was on the fire department, I guess, for 25 years. But I enjoyed that, too. That was, fire department is, you know, now as then, why a great bunch of guys. Nowadays, they've accomplished way more training than in the old days. I retired in 1990, and the present guys have much more training. They're more skilled, and they have great equipment, and they do a great job.
Absolutely. We depend on them.
Yep.
And you think of some of the more dramatic fires over those years that
There were a few small ones at Minnesota
Yeah,
Malting.
there's some small ones, but no serious property damage.
Right.
Probably the scariest one was, you know, the fire department. Actually, I think I burned on the old Rick Madsen farm north of town. They burnt the barn, and probably the wind came up and it got to be something fierce. It didn't, I guess, well, wasn't any danger, but it was a fierce fire.
Yeah, yeah. You know, some of those can be pretty challenging. It probably was in your era that I'm quite sure it must have been. It wasn't a very challenging fire, but early on, my wife worked at the Beacon, and Dick sent her out to cover a fire at Martin Benson's, and she came home and told me that Jim Cherwinka had told her that you can't cover a fire unless you go in. So he got her all suited up, and she went and covered the fire from the inside. So that probably wouldn't happen today either.
Probably not.
Well, this has been most enjoyable. If you guys have anything else that you won't remember tomorrow, but remember now, we should sure add it. But it's, I think, a great interview to capture for Channel 12 and the museum for posterity, for sure. So I'd like to thank you both.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.